locked in a crushing vise of ice for 21 months. They ate their boots and their dogs to survive. When the rescue finally arrived, they found a row of frozen statues. One hand still held a diary of the unthinkable. The pencil lead snaps with the sound of a pistol shot in the silence of the tent. George DeLong does not curse. He has no moisture left in his mouth to form a word, and no heat in his lungs to push it out. He stares at the jagged wooden stump in his frozen hand. The air inside the canvas is a thick, choking fog of crystalline frost, and the copper tang of old blood. It is minus 40 degrees, a temperature that does not just chill, but bites like a serrated blade, sawing through the wool of his coat and the marrow of his ribs. Beside him, the shape under the stiff reindeer skin does not move. It has not moved since the sun went down, or perhaps 2 suns ago. Time has dissolved into a gray blur of wind and whiteout. A sudden gust hammers against the tent, the fabric snapping like a whip. And for a second, the screaming wind sounds like the ship. It sounds like the Jeannette again. The terrifying groan of iron-strengthened oak being ground into splinters by the black teeth of the pack ice. He can almost smell the bilge water and the coal smoke. But when he blinks, there is only the stench of gangrene and the sweet, sickly aroma of rot rising from his own feet. His fingers are black, charcoal-colored talons that barely feel the weight of the diary. He looks at the last sentence written in shaky, sprawling letters. His eyes wander to the tent flap, where a sliver of the Siberian moon casts a blue, ghostly light across the row of frozen boots belonging to men who will never stand again. He reaches for the small bottle of glycerin, but his grip fails. The glass shatters on the ice-crusted floor, the liquid freezing instantly into a mocking diamond. He realizes then that the silence is the loudest thing in the Arctic. It is the sound of a world that has finally finished swallowing them whole. He leans back against the icy support pole, his heart a slow, erratic drumbeat in a hollow chest. He wonders if the people in San Francisco still remember the names of the men who sailed for the open sea. He wonders if they know that the gate to the pole is not made of water, but of teeth. He closes his eyes and waits for the frost to finish its work. Leaving the book as the only witness to the horror in the delta, there is a faint scratching at the canvas, the wind, or something worse. And the dark realization settles in that they were never the hunters, but the bait. The sun hangs over the harbor like a golden coin tossed by a confident gambler. In July 1879, the city of San Francisco does not just cheer, it roars. Thousands of people line the docks, their handkerchiefs fluttering in the wind like the wings of a million white birds. Band music swells, the brass instruments catching the light, drowning out the gentle lap of the Pacific against the hull of the Jeannette. She is a beautiful creature, a 3-masted bark reinforced with thick beams of oak and iron, her steam engine pulsing like a steady heart. On the deck, George Washington DeLong stands tall. His uniform is crisp, his brass buttons gleaming, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the blue water meets the infinite sky. He is a man fueled by the fire of a grand theory. Scientists in comfortable offices thousands of miles away have spoken of a secret. They call it the open polar sea. They whisper of a warm current that flows beneath the ice, a hidden doorway to the top of the world, where the water never freezes and the air is soft. DeLong believes them. He carries the weight of national pride and the heavy purse of the New York Herald on his shoulders. The ship is a floating fortress of optimism, packed with 2 years of coal, fine wines, scientific instruments, and the best canned meats money can buy. The crew is young and strong, their laughter echoing off the water as they wave to their wives and sweethearts. They do not see the Arctic as a graveyard, but as a map waiting to be filled. The ship moves forward, cutting through the waves with a grace that suggests she is invincible. But as the coast of California fades into a purple smudge, the warmth begins to drain from the world. Week by week, the sky turns a bruised, heavy gray. The air begins to bite. By the time they reach the Bering Strait, The festive music of the departure has been replaced by the eerie, metallic sound of the wind whistling through the rigging. Then comes September 6th. It starts as a low, grinding hum. A few jagged pieces of white ice appear, drifting like broken glass. Then more arrive, larger and more aggressive, crowding the hull. DeLong orders full steam, the engine groaning as the propeller churns the dark water. But the ice does not move. It is a vast, white continent that has decided to close its gates. Within hours, the open water vanishes. The Jeannette is no longer a ship. She is a splinter caught in a tightening fist. The wood of the hull begins to talk, a series of sharp cracks and deep moans that make the men stop in their tracks and listen. They are trapped near Herald Island, less than 60 miles from the start of their true journey. The grand theory of the open polar sea shatters like a dropped mirror. There is no warm current. There is only a frozen desert that stretches for 1,000 miles. The men look out over the rail and see a landscape that does not belong to the world of the living. It is a jagged, white labyrinth of pressure ridges and bottomless blue cracks. The sun, once their golden friend, now begins to slip below the horizon for longer and longer periods, leaving them in a twilight that smells of salt and old snow. They realize with a sudden, sickening jolt that the ship is no longer theirs to command. The ice is the captain now. It will decide where they go and when they die. They settle in for the long drift, believing it will last a few weeks, perhaps a month. They do not know that they have just stepped into a cage that will hold them for 21 months. The optimism of San Francisco feels like a dream from another life. Out here, the only thing that is real is the cold, and the cold is beginning to get hungry. For 611 days, the ice held them in a frozen paralysis. But on June 13th, 1881, the monster finally decided to finish its meal. The pressure had been building for 48 hours, a low, tectonic thrumming that vibrated through the soles of the men's boots. Then the sound changed. It was no longer a hum, but a scream. The thick oak beams of the Jeannette, reinforced with iron and hope, began to snap like dry kindling. Below deck, the hull buckled inward, a seam opened, and the black, freezing water of the Arctic Ocean hissed into the engine room. George Melville stood in the rising flood, his beard dripping with oil, shouting orders over the roar of the incoming tide. There was no time for grace. DeLong gave the command to abandon ship. The crew scrambled across the slanted, slippery deck, throwing crates of hardtack and canisters of pemmican onto the jagged ice floes. They hauled the heavy wooden whaleboats over the rail just as the ship groaned in a final, agonizing spasm. The ice was literally shearing the vessel in half. Men slipped and fell, their hands raw and bleeding from the frozen ropes, their breath coming in ragged puffs of white steam. They stood on the floe, a small, shivering huddle of 33 souls, and watched their only home vanish. The Jeannette did not go quietly. Her masts shivered and her rigging snapped with the sound of whip cracks. Slowly, the stern rose into the air, exposing the propeller that had once promised them a path to glory. Then, with a sickening gurgle of air and salt, the dark water swallowed her whole. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the ice. The masts were gone. The smoke from the galley fire was gone, in every direction. For as far as the eye could reach, there was only the white, splintered wasteland of the pack ice. The realization hit them like a physical blow to the chest. They were hundreds of miles from the nearest land, standing on a moving, cracking sidewalk of ice that could vanish beneath their feet at any second. Their first casualty was their sense of safety. DeLong looked at his men. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with the shock of sudden homelessness. They were no longer explorers. They were prey. The order was given to pack the sleds. They had to haul 3 massive wooden boats, each weighing thousands of pounds, across a surface that looked like a graveyard of giant white marble. To make room for food, they had to make a terrible choice. The sled dogs, their loyal companions through the long dark, were becoming a luxury they could not afford. The first shot rang out, flat and sharp against the ice. Then another. The warm blood of the huskies steamed in the freezing air, turning the pristine white snow into a vivid, terrifying crimson. The men did not look at each other as they butchered the animals for meat. They worked with mechanical, numb movements, their fingers fumbling with the skinning knives. Every scrap of protein was a day of life. They hitched themselves to the heavy sleds with leather harnesses, leaning their weight into the ropes until the wood creaked and their muscles screamed. They began to pull. Behind them lay the empty hole in the ice where their ship had been. Ahead lay nothing but a horizon of jagged ridges and the biting, relentless wind that seemed to laugh at their effort. They were walking into a white void, pulling the weight of their own coffins, beginning a march that would tear the spirit from their bodies before the cold took the rest. The march became a dance of the damned. For weeks they hauled the heavy whaleboats over a landscape that was never meant for human feet. The ice was not a flat road. It was a chaotic city of glass ruins. They climbed over pressure ridges as high as houses, only to find a black lead of open water on the other side. They would launch the boats, row for an hour, and then find the path blocked by another wall of white stone. It was Sisyphus, in the Arctic. To make the horror complete, the ocean currents mocked them. They would toil south for 10 miles in a day, exhausting their hearts and lungs, only to wake up and find the drifting ice had carried them 11 miles north. They were walking backward, toward their graves. Physical decay arrived with quiet, rhythmic cruelty. It began with the feet. Constant soaking in salt water and the biting freeze created the trench foot. The skin of their toes turned a pale, sickly white, then a bruised purple, and finally a necrotic charcoal black. Every step was like treading on broken glass and hot coals. George DeLong watched as his men sat in the snow to pull off their wool socks, only to have the skin peel away with the fabric. Scurvy began to loosen their teeth. Their gums became soft, bloody sponges. Old wounds from years ago opened up as if the body had forgotten how to heal itself. They did not smell like men anymore. They smelled of wet wool, wood smoke, and the sweet, heavy scent of gangrene. The hunger was a physical weight in their bellies. When the dog meat ran out, they turned to anything that could be chewed. They boiled strips of oil-tanned reindeer skin from their sleeping bags. They chewed on the leather of their own boot soles, the salt and dirt stinging their cracked lips. Some men began to see things in the white void. They saw green fields in Ohio and steaming plates of beef in San Francisco. They spoke to ghosts who stood just behind the next ice hummock. The silence of the Arctic was the worst enemy. It was an absolute, heavy pressure that made the ears ring. The only sounds were the rhythmic crunch of the snow, the ragged wheezing of starved lungs, and the occasional high-pitched scream of the ice shifting under the weight of the tide. The sky was a flat, unblinking eye of gray. The sun offered light, but no warmth. It was a sterile world of salt and frost, one by one. The sled dogs that remained were silenced to provide a few more ounces of bitter fat. The men ate the meat raw, because they were too tired to build a fire. Their faces became masks of soot and frostbite, the skin peeling away in jagged flakes. They no longer looked at each other. To look at a comrade was to see your own death reflected in a pair of hollow, sunken eyes. They were no longer sailors or scientists. They were ghosts dragging wood through a nightmare. The ice was breathing, moving, and waiting. It knew that it did not have to strike. It only had to wait for the men to stop moving. And the men were very, very tired. The ocean decided to break them on the night of September 12th, 1881. For weeks they had hauled the boats across the ice, but now the ice had vanished, replaced by a black, churning cauldron of salt water. 3 small wooden boats danced on the edge of a nightmare. The wind did not blow. It screamed, a high-pitched howl that tore the tops off the waves and turned the spray into stinging needles of ice. George DeLong sat at the tiller of the first cutter. His frozen hands locked around the wood like iron claws. To his left was the second cutter under Lieutenant Chip. To his right was the whaleboat commanded by the engineer Melville. They were 3 specks of dust in a hurricane. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the terrifying white crests of waves that rose like mountains above their tiny gunnels. Then came the gale. It hit with the force of a falling wall. A massive wave, blacker than the night itself, reared up between the vessels. DeLong watched through salt-crusted eyes as Chip's boat rose on the crest of a foaming surge. For one heartbeat, the second cutter was silhouetted against a flash of lightning, a fragile toy tossed toward the stars. Then the wave broke. When the water cleared, the spot where the second cutter had been was empty. Lieutenant Chip and his 8 men had been swallowed by the Arctic, without a single cry reaching the others. They were gone, deleted from the world. There was no time to mourn. The storm drove the remaining 2 boats apart, casting them into the chaos of the Siberian coast. DeLong's boat was slammed onto the muddy banks of the Lena Delta. The men crawled out of the surf like half-drowned rats, their legs buckling under the weight of their sodden clothes. They thought they had found salvation, but the Delta was a fresh deception. It was a labyrinth of frozen mud, shallow streams, and endless, waist-deep snow. It was a map drawn by a madman. There were no trees for fire, no animals for food, and no villages in sight. The wind here was different from the ocean gale. It was a dry, hollow thief that stole the last of their body heat. They began to walk, their boots sinking into the freezing muck with every step. Every mile felt like 10. They were searching for a settlement they could not name in a wasteland that did not end. They crossed half-frozen rivers, the ice breaking beneath them, plunging their exhausted bodies into water that felt like liquid fire. They were so cold that their skin stopped shivering. That was the most dangerous sign. It meant the inner core was dying. DeLong looked back at the trail they left in the snow. It was a line of dark, staggering shapes. They were leaving their equipment behind, dropping shovels and blankets because their muscles simply refused to hold them. The hunger was no longer a sharp pain. It was a heavy, dull ache that made their heads swim. They began to eat the last of their glycerin and the scraps of their deerskin coats. The Delta was not land. It was a frozen trap designed to exhaust them until they simply lay down and let the white blanket cover them. They were moving, but they were already ghosts. The horizon offered no hope, only a flat, gray line where the frozen earth met the frozen sky. They were alone at the end of the world, and the world was closing its eyes. The end did not come with a scream. It came with the sound of a pencil scratching against paper in a tent that had become a tomb. By late October, 1881, the Lena Delta had finished its work. The hunger was no longer a beast clawing at their insides. It was a cold, hollow void that had settled into their very bones. One by one, the men of the first cutter lay down in the snow and simply stopped. Alexei was the first to go in those final days. Then Kak. Then Gortz. DeLong watched them die with eyes that had seen too much horror to weep. His hands were black stumps of frostbitten flesh, but he forced his fingers to grip the pencil. He wrote their names. He recorded the time. It was his last act of command. On the 140th day since the sinking of the Jeannette, he ate the last scraps of a deer's skin coat. It tasted of salt and old hair. On October 30th, he made his final entry. It was a short list of the dead. He knew the end was seconds away. He crawled to the opening of the tent and looked out at the vast, indifferent white of Siberia. He took the diary, the only surviving witness to their agony, and tossed it behind him, so his own dying body would not bury the words. He lay down in the row with his men, a captain staying with his crew until the very last ember of life went out. The snow began to fall, a soft and silent shroud that erased the shapes of the bodies and the curve of the tent. 5 months passed. The Arctic winter roared and then retreated, replaced by the pale, weak sun of spring 1882. George Melville, the engineer who had survived against all odds, returned to the Delta with a search party. He walked through the melting slush, his eyes scanning the horizon for anything that was not white or gray. He found it, a single bronze tea kettle hanging from a tripod of driftwood. Near it, a hand reached out of the snow, a frozen gesture that seemed to point toward the river. Melville began to dig. He found them arranged in a morbidly perfect military formation, lying side by side as if at rest in a barracks. Their faces were marble. Their skin was like parchment stretched over bone. He found the diary just where DeLong had thrown it. The ink was still clear. A haunting voice reaching out from the grave to tell the story of the ice in the Gale. The legacy of the Jeannette was written in blood and frost, but it changed the world. Years later, wreckage from the ship was found on the coast of Greenland, thousands of miles away. It proved what DeLong had died to discover. The ice was not a wall, but a river. It moved across the top of the world in a great transpolar drift. His tragedy became the foundation for every explorer who followed, a map of what was possible, and a warning of what it cost. The bodies were eventually brought home, but their spirits remained in the high latitudes. They are part of the wind now. They are part of the grinding ice. The story of the Jeannette is a testament to the terrifying strength of the human will and the absolute, crushing power of the natural world. It is a reminder that the Arctic does not forgive mistakes, and it does not remember names. It only remembers the cold.